Hey, everybody. It's Monday night. You know what that means. It's time for Disputed Lands. And I am so thankful once again to be joined by my guest who didn't know it before now is the guest I've had on the most overall now on Disputed Lands. He's making his third appearance, the first person I've ever had on three times in a little over a year. So I'm pretty happy the honor kind of goes to Doug. Really, he's become a really good friend, and he's just such a joy to be around. That I couldn't think of a better person to be number three. That's a significant number right there.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So we're talking tonight again about his book, Rebooting the Bible, the astonishing story of a 19-year-old. I like to say nearly 2,000. I just like that. Nearly 2,000-year-old rabbinical conspiracy to corrupt the Bible's ancient history and thwart belief in Jesus as the Messiah. And that really is it in a nutshell. I am having a lot of fun reading this book and going through the notes. I've gained so much. Our other Doug, my other friend Doug Krieger, has already read it and done a review, which is no surprise to me. The man is a machine. I don't know how he does it, but we're going to pick up where we left off. But before we do that, I wanted to first let Doug have a chance to address two things. People didn't heed my warning, Doug, the first time this aired over on the Now You See TV channel.
Okay.
They did not heed the warnings to listen carefully.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing they said is that you don't believe that the King James version of the scriptures is the Bible.
No, it's absolutely the Bible.
Okay. Well, I mean, I just needed you to say that because people heard that, and I don't know how they got that, but that's what it is in scripture or something that could be trusted as a source of scripture.
Clarify it, like every other version translation of the Bible has its flaws. That's the point that I was making, because there are many, as you know, more fundamentalists versus evangelicals. We're both evangelicals. We're probably not fundamentalists, which itself is an interesting discussion to get into. But those that perceive the King James Version as the only version because it is inerrant, infallible, the 1611 translation, that's the bone of contention here.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The others heard it the other way when you talked about the Talmud and how things were taken from that and used in our Constitution, which ultimately came from the scriptures themselves. They heard you touting the Talmud as something that we ought to be heeding. That's the other people. Is that what you said, Doug?
Well, I provide a 22-page discussion on the history of the Talmud, primarily so that our Jewish friends that read the book will understand that my picking on the rabbis is related to the first century, second century, and it's not really related to the Jewish community afterwards, because after the second century, we get into the third, the Jewish communities are essentially cut off from the true Tanakh. They are focused on the Mishnah and the Talmud.
Yeah, we're going to get there. We're going to get there.
Right,
we're going to get.
I don't have to go too far there.
Because
that was not my point. I was trying to keep being called an anti-Semite.
Yeah, that we're getting to kind of that in this chapter, because I wanted you to be able to address those two things right off, because people did not heed the warning to listen carefully during the first interview. Right. I wanted you to be able to clear that up right off the bat.
Sure.
Okay, so first place we're going to catch up on here, we're going to start off right in chapter 2, which is entitled Rabbi Akiva, the Bar Kokhba Revolt, and the LXX Attack Begins. This starts off with Matthew. You talk a verse in Matthew 24:2, but go ahead and take us into what
in the book.
Yeah, you talk about the history here and of what has taken place, the Messiah and his coming, which is an apt place to start for this chapter and what you have to say in it. But kind of first, what did you think, or when you came across the information about Akiva, was it the first time for this book, or had you Well,
Right.
just tell me the history of this
Right.
to begin with.
You know, I certainly knew and had heard quite a lot about the. By the way, my screensaver came on. Are you still seeing me? Okay.
We see you fine.
Okay, good. I'll have to keep wiggling my cursor on my screen so that the screensaver doesn't come on. I knew quite a bit about the Bar Kokhba rebellion, 135, sort of 132 to 135 AD. I had heard of Rabbi Akiba, knew he was one of the primary founders, if you will, of what I would call the New Judaism, which was the post-temple Judaism. And I didn't know much else. Almost all of this book, you know, I probably knew 25% of what's in the book, but 75% I've actually learned through research over the past, I'd say, 12 months.
Yeah, you know, this period is, of course, as you know, where I did a lot of my research as well, and I love the study around this time frame. You start with the Herod's Temple, and it's being destroyed. Now we're going to get into some interesting points of this. To set this place in history, the Bar Kokhba revolt was actually one of 3 wars at that time that had taken place. And tell us a little bit about this Bar Kokhba revolt.
Right. Yeah. Just of course, the Great Revolt, as it's called, was the revolt from about 66 to 70 AD with the destruction of the temple, but really continued on to the final battle at It
was called the Kitos War. It was the second one.
No, that's the second, Masada. Masada really ended the first Great Revolt. The Kitos War is a war that almost none of us have heard anything about, which really occurred around 119 AD.
And it wasn't really centralized in the Jerusalem area.
It did not touch much in the land of Judah or Israel or Palestine. It mostly affected other places in North Africa and some in the islands off of Greece and so forth. It was an extremely bloody war, and there were literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Gentiles that were killed, including tens of thousands of Roman militia that were killed in this second war. And then the third war was the Bar Kokhba revolt, and it really occurred for about 3.5 years. All these wars took place about 3.5 years in length.
And they started. It's interesting is they all started at about the time of Passover and ended at the 9th of Av.
Yeah, that's right. The particularly the Bar Kokhba revolt. We get a little bit into the possibility that there was already a third temple as a result of what Bar Kokhba was doing in Jerusalem.
And I looked at that when your notes too, and I kind of looked into that, but that was centered more about where his stronghold was, and wasn't even in anywhere close to where the temple originally would.
No, that's not accurate. No, they're both places. Both places are relevant to the story. His fortress was outside of Jerusalem. And but no, the possibility that there was a third temple, what was on the Temple Mount. I show the figure of the coin that shows the columns and so forth. And so there is a possibility that's discussed that there was a small temple that was erected. It was the third temple, and likewise, as you pointed out, the whole uprising of the Bar Kokhba revolt concluded on the 9th of Av. So we had that occurred in 576 BC, in 70 AD, and here in 135 AD. So remarkable coincidences, you might say, if you believe in coincidence.
Well, I do not. This is clearly a spiritual battle. And the reason it's very important to understand this is because we got to understand the context of what was taking place around the Jewish people at the time of the formation of the writings that came to be. So
correct.
It's crucial to understand that.
That's correct.
Out from among these, which became to be known as a leader of the descendants of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which were actually done away with, and you talk about here, they became what we know today as the rabbis. And we're going to talk. I love this kind of detail because it's so key to understanding how things come to be.
Yes.
But you said here, and I don't know what page it is on the hard copy there, but this is on 68 here in the PDF. You said, Rabbi, this is the very last paragraph on that page. It says, Rabbi Akiba ben Yosef would become a leader at the academies near present-day Tel Aviv in a village known as
Javne or Jamnia.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Javne in 90 AD to 136. Now, here's what I found important about this. This is right. Why do these guys always end up near Tyre and Sidon?
Yeah.
I mean,
going back to northern Israel, home of all manner of
Dan and the birthplace of a lot of the Babylonian.
Right.
So
Baal worship.
So tell us about this Rabbi Akiba.
Yeah. Well, so there were a series of rabbis. I'll kind of go back to my book here to refer to a few of the names because
go right ahead.
Names are stuck in my mind. But a particular rabbi was in fact the founder, more or less, of the academies and a founder of the movement that Akiba eventually became sort of the dominating figure of. But the original rabbi that was in effect the founder was actually taken out of the city of Jerusalem as the temple, just before the temple was destroyed. The Zealots were in control of Jerusalem, and the Zealots would not let anyone leave. All right, so they were not going to let any of the Pharisees leave, any of the scribes, the Sanhedrin. No one was going to be allowed to leave. They were all there to fight to the death. So that's the typical zealot kind of attitude. But the particular rabbi, and I'm not finding his name right here, so forgive me for that, but maybe it'll pop up here as I'm thumbing through pages. But a particular rabbi that was the founder, was really the leader at the time of the Pharisees. He played dead. They put him in a coffin. They convinced the Zealots to let him to be taken out to be buried. So they took him out. He left the coffin. He went to meet with Titus, and Titus agreed that they could form the academies at Javnia. And really, the purpose of the academies was to reinvent Jewish religion because the temple had been destroyed.
You know what I found very interesting is that, I mean, we already know that those who were not accepting of God's covenant, what God had in design, were in charge at the temple already. Yeshua called them a den of vipers.
Right. Well, let me run through that real quick. You essentially have several different groups. You have the scribes, and the scribes and the Sadducees, high degree of overlap. The scribes, of course, were really considered those that were copyists of the of the scripture and so forth. The Sadducees were in effect associated with the temple. They were the temple priests. So the scribes and the Sadducees were associated with the temple worship. They were generally not believers in the resurrection, as you recall. They were not believers in the supernatural. The Pharisees were, but the Sadducees and the scribes were not. The Sanhedrin also existed. It was the body of 70 elders, predominantly Sadducees, that governed the country. All right, so the Pharisees, for the most part, were a group. The word Pharisee means separatists. And the Essenes were also separatists, but they were more extreme than the Pharisees. But after the temple was destroyed, the Sadducees were very unpopular with the common people anyway. Common people viewed them just as Jesus did. Remember, Jesus was of the common people. Very uncommon human, but he was of the common people. And so he saw them for being basically money grubbers. And the people saw them the same way, that they were not pious. They did not really believe in the true religion of Judaism. And so the people were anxious to get rid of them. So the Pharisees were really the only survivors of all the different cults, you might say. And the Essenes were a cult, the Pharisees were a cult. The Essenes, of course, were going to be destroyed as part of the Roman War, really part of the Great Revolt and before the Kitos War. So the Essenes would be gone, but the Pharisees were going to go through a name change. So they were going to go through a rebranding. And when they went through the rebranding, they became the rabbis. And so this is well documented by various Jewish scholars that the Pharisees and the rabbis are one and the same. Now, so it's important to understand that you had the party that hated Jesus and his followers, and they hated what Jesus stood for. And for them, the religion was all about the law, keeping the law, being pure. And for them, it was not just about the written law. It was not just about the Torah, but it was about the oral law as well. And so that was really what the Pharisees were focused on. And I'll just make one other comment, then I'll pause. As we get to the end of the first century, the Pharisees were in firm control of the future of Judaism. All their other competitors were gone. The only other competitive cult at the time was this cult called Christianity.
And,
all right.
Yeah, they're aligned at
that time.
Yeah, their alignment can clearly be seen. Josephus, this is interesting. Josephus records for us that after, of course, the temple curtain which separated the Holy of Holies was rent in two at Yeshua's crucifixion. We know that, but Josephus records for us that curtain had been replaced, and it was replaced with a purple one, just as big, that was made in Babylon, and it had a picture of the heavens upon it.
Wow, that is fabulous. I didn't know that. That's a great piece of information.
I mean, it just tells you the alignment of these guys, I think, with a perfect one image. You can tell the alignment of these guys of where they felt their knowledge derived from.
Right. From Babylon in this case.
Right, which, like we just said, it makes sense to me that when they saw another place to gather, to reform, where else would they go but someplace they felt at home, right?
Right.
Someplace that they felt comfortable.
Essentially it's true. There were two major locations. I mean, the Jews were dispersed, right? The diaspora, they were dispersed lots of places, but the two major places they were located was in Alexandria and in Babylon. Of course, they, as you well know, and many of your listeners know, many of the Jews, most of the Jews, a large majority, did not come back from the captivity. They stayed in Babylon. And so when it came time to leave Palestine, which really was by the middle of the 2nd century, most of the Jews went to Babylon. And it was in Babylon where the Mishnah, which was really the focus of the oral law, when the oral law was written, and then from then, for the next 400 years or so, certainly closer to 300 years, they would begin to build the Talmud, right? So the Talmud was really, in effect, a commentary on the Mishnah, and a commentary on many other things as well, of course. So that's really but beyond that, you had the Jewish diaspora, and but those are the two cities that where Jews were very, very dominant.
Yes, I'm just going to summarize what you said, because it said it here.
Sure.
It says the destruction of the Second Temple, Jamnia, would become the center for restructuring Judaism. This project that came out of that was the oral law, or the Talmud, recorded in two flavors, Palestinian and more influential Babylonian, whereby the oral law would overtake the written law, or the Torah, as the dominating influence, driving the theology, ritual practice, and culture of the Jewish religion. This isn't just your opinion. This is what Jewish scholars say. Quote, Judaism became a distinctive religion quite different from what it was before.
Right. Correct.
And
a little bit of a gloss there on the Talmud. There are distinctions between, to be exact, between the Tanakh, the Mishnah, the Talmud, and so forth. Just to be careful there, but still, that's the point. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm going to use your words you used in the book here because they're very well worded and specific. The old Judaism emphasized the temple, the priesthood, and the written law of Moses.
Correct.
Absolutely. But instead of emphasizing the words of God in the Tanakh, or the full Bible of the law and the prophets and the writings, the emphasis shifted to the Mishnah, or oral law, supposedly given to Moses on Mount Sinai at the same time as the written law. And this is where the essence of their authority they feel is derived.
Correct.
Now, we know from reading in the scriptures that a knowledge of God's law obviously existed, of his righteous law, because he hasn't changed who he is and what he is. It was just revealed in there.
Right.
Didn't change. There was knowledge of that by the Old Testament prophets who were before the law. We know that by the things that they did. They had an understanding of God's law before it was written down. But this is the excuse that these guys used to gain their authority.
Correct. Correct. It was a question of how do they put themselves in a position where they call the shots. And so it wasn't enough that all of their other competitors, like the Sadducees, were gone. It had to be something that the people could honor. And so it was felt that the oral law, which was an esoteric myth to some extent, of course, Jesus reacted sternly to the notion of the oral law, saying it was the tradition of men. It was not the law of God. So, but yes, it was the basis for them to build in the authority and to put the rabbi at really the center of the Jewish community. Right.
And that circles us back to where we're to Rabbi Akiba. He became the leader. I wanted to highlight that because you so well put that in the book, and it's something that I have known for a long time. But when you highlight it there and you speak about it clearly, I mean, some of these things seem like they're such small things and they're so quickly said. You could say that in one sentence, but we don't understand exactly how much power and how large this beast grew into.
That's right.
With such a simple thing. We seems so simple or innocuous, seemingly innocuous.
We really have so little knowledge of the history of Judaism after Jesus, right?
Right. Yeah. So that leads to Rabbi Akiba. So tell us about Rabbi Akiba, not just in relation to the war, but what he ended up doing. I'll just let you take it from there.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk in a moment about the fact that Akiba supports Bar Kokhba in the war, which leads to his undoing. However, Akiba's goal and the goal of the Jamnia Academy was to take the Jewish community, to keep the Jewish community from continuing to follow the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. The Greek Old Testament throughout the world was the Bible of the Jews. But because of the emergence of Christianity and the fact that the Christians were writing their gospels and their letters and their scriptures in Greek, what happened is that the Christian writers were all quoting from the Septuagint, from the Greek Old Testament. Pretty soon, it was viewed, certainly by the rabbis in the beginning of the 2nd century, that the Septuagint had become the Christian Bible. And so they decided that one of the key things they had to do, and it's believed that Akiba really was the primary driver of this, was that they had to alter the scripture to make it less obvious that Jesus was the Messiah. They obviously did not like Jesus, and they wanted the religion to be based upon the law. They wanted themselves to be at the center of that law. So it couldn't just be just the Torah. It also had to be the oral law as well.
Yeah, and these guys were not stupid. I mean, think about the undertaking. I mean, these guys he was certainly the leader, but he had other disciples underneath him, and these guys had all given their lives to understanding the mysteries and understanding the scriptures. I mean, this is what they spent their whole lives doing. So their undertaking wasn't done in ignorance, and probably with a lot more understanding than perhaps most of us would have when it came to exactly what they were setting out to do, spiritually speaking. Full knowledge of what they were going to accomplish, and no small task.
Right. So they in effect were reinventing Judaism without the temple. They were distancing themselves from Christianity. Really, by the time you get to the 3rd century and you get to Babylon, there's almost no overlap between Christianity and Judaism. Judaism then becomes the Mishnah, it becomes the Talmud, and it stays that way for the most part throughout the next 1,000 years. There's obviously still interaction at times, but for the most part, you see more interaction and much more compatibility between the Jews and the Muslims than with the Christians, right?
Yeah, and you point out, and I don't know that you necessarily pointed out, but you do highlight these two aspects in the book, and this along with the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was the other side of this going on. Both had a singular goal: to eradicate a Messiah and to put forth a different one.
Correct. That's correct. Yes, and it was, and this gets into sort of the details of the changes made in the verses. Is that the Pharisees, really the Jewish, we could call them the Jewish elite, the Jewish intelligentsia, they did not believe their Messiah would be deity. They believed their Messiah would be a powerful political warrior. He would be the son of David, and he would be a descendant, but he would not be the second person of a Trinity. He would not be equal with Yahweh. And so they made clear in the changes they made in what we call the Masoretic text. And we need to kind of go back and pick up on that a little bit. But they made changes to make it clear that that was not the way they understood the Messiah. And of course, that conflicted very much with the teaching of Christianity and the teaching of Jesus.
Well, they didn't want him to be, they didn't. They just simply had rejected him and didn't want him to be. It wasn't the God that they wanted. I thought it was.
No, they didn't want to repent either, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it was the giving up their power, their authority, all those things. But it was very interesting. Bar Kokhba, meaning son of the star. Those who have read my book, the Arc de Triomphe in Paris is actually called the Arch of the Star. It's very interesting how that all. Anyway, that's just a side note for those who've read
the connections there are, of course, fascinating. But yes,
they're so deep
from Judah and so forth. So
there's so many different rabbit trails and deep things you could.
Oh yeah,
I'm going to try to stay on point. So
that's all right.
So go ahead. So
Bar Kokhba, just to kind of bring that story into it. So Bar Kokhba became a warrior. He was a fierce warrior. The Romans were attacked. They had been obviously victimized greatly in the Kitos War. So this was only about a dozen years later when the Bar Kokhba revolt occurred. And it became a massive affair. There were probably 500,000 troops in Bar Kokhba's army. The Romans moved perhaps as many as 200,000 of their troops, which was, I think it was like 60% of their army worldwide. They moved it to Palestine to fight the Bar Kokhba wars, the Jewish wars. Most of us don't realize that the Jews became, in many ways, the greatest enemy of the Romans because of the size of their army and the number of deaths that they inflicted upon Rome. And so Rome had to basically throw everything at them. Certainly from the time of Hannibal, Hannibal was probably the most successful warrior against Rome. But from that time, which of course was almost like 300 BC, up to the time of Bar Kokhba, 400 years later, the Jews became the number one enemy of the Romans. Well, eventually, of course, the Romans conquered Bar Kokhba. He was put to death. Rabbi Akiva was actually arrested, was taken to Rome, and was tried and was tortured to death in a rather grisly manner. And he was tortured to death because he supported Bar Kokhba as the Messiah. All right, and so with that, of course, then becomes the plowing up Jerusalem, salting the land, renaming the land Palestine, renaming Jerusalem Palestina Capitolina after the Caesar as well.
The man's name you were trying to think of earlier that really raised Akiva to us was Ben Koziba.
Yeah, that's right, Ben Koziba. Yes, he was the you might say the founding Pharisee.
Right. So that was the name you were looking for earlier.
Thank you. I'll get these memorized after.
You're welcome. So here's what it says. Here's what it says of this Akiva character. We should note that the comment of Maimonides, who is also known as to anybody who does research,
Maimonides.
Yeah, Maimonides. I call him Maimonides because it sounds like lemonade. But
he's also known as Ramban.
Yeah, Ramban. Anybody who does any kind of Jewish research, if you don't run across the name Ramban, you've not looked in the right places.
Yeah, he's the greatest scholar in the medieval period for about.
He is probably the most quoted, I think, of all of them. So anyway, Maimonides says this: the most famous Torah scholar in the Middle Ages, Rabbi Akiva, was a great sage, one of the authors of the Mishnah, yet he was the right-hand man of Ben Koziba, the ruler whom he thought to be King Messiah. He and all the sages of his generation imagined Bar Kokhba to be the King Messiah until he was slain, unfortunately.
Right.
Once he was slain, it dawned on them that he was not the Messiah. You think?
Yeah. Unfortunately.
But Maimonides says that calls him the greatest. One of the other quotes says, Friedman asserts, Akiva is the best known and most highly regarded of all the rabbis. Legends and stories about him abound. Some of the other, so
Friedman wrote, there's a couple of popular books about Judaism, and Friedman wrote one of the best.
Yeah, so it's just so. That's who this guy was. He was the go-to guy during this time of great conflict socially. We already know about the conflict socially that happened at the time of Yeshua, but it didn't end there. Right. And so this Talmudic Judaism, based on Mishnah, where the Tanakh and the Torah took second place to the Mishnah.
Right.
That's the environment of this. And they were seeking to reform and maintain their control, whatever minimal control it may have over those who considered themselves faithful Jewish followers, encounter in trying to not only to do reform and to keep this, but encounter to the true faith that Yeshua had, of course, revealed. And so he had a purpose when he set to do the translations. Pick up from there.
Okay. Yeah, and so what had occurred, as I mentioned before, is that the Old Greek Septuagint, known as the OG Old Greek Septuagint, that was translated from as close to the original Hebrew, authentic Hebrew Bible as we can get within 200 years of the time of Ezra. That was written starting about 285 BC, completed. Most of the Hebrew was completed by 200 BC. Some of the Greek books of the Apocrypha were written and completed within another 50 or 70 years. But anyway, so the Old Greek was identified as the Christian Bible. And so it was Akiba's determination that what was needed was to take the Hebrew, which we call, the original Hebrew is known as a Vorlage, Vorlage, which means like an original writing from which copies are made. All right. And so the Vorlog used for the Septuagint was, for all intents and purposes, the original Bible. It was brought from Jerusalem within 200 years of its compilation. Around 450 BC, it was brought to Alexandria, and it was translated there. All right, now shift to about 300 and almost 400 years into the future. You have Akiba, you have the academies at Jamnia, and they decide they're going to take the Vorlog, and they are going, which may or may not have been the same as what was the original Hebrew Vorlog, which, as you know, may have been carted off to Rome. All right. May have been in one of the boxes.
I have no doubt that it was.
Yeah, yeah.
No doubt.
Anyway, so you've got that possibility. But they went in and they changed several areas. They changed the Messianic prophecy in roughly, I would say, probably 36 verses. There are many other changes, differences in wording. I referenced some of those. The ones we care most about, though, are the verses that were dealing with the nature of who the Messiah is, who would come to love the Messiah, i.e. the Gentiles, and how the Gentiles would be saved, the nature of the salvation, which was not the law. So that was the focus of the changes that were made in what we could call the proto-Masoretic text that would become the Masoretic text that would feed the King James version of the Bible and most of the other Protestant versions of the Bible. All right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I hope people heard, you had a lot to say, and this is where people do not want to listen carefully.
Yeah, yeah.
There are essentially two versions that stand.
Two Vorlogs. How about that?
Two Vorlogs.
Yeah.
That which was used. I'm about to lose my battery. I got to plug in real quick. I
decided I have to lean forward. For those of you that do not know, I'm recovering from back surgery, and that's why you're seeing me bedridden at the moment. It's because I'm recovering from a very serious surgery. It was planned, but it's not like cutting your finger when you have back surgery, because they put spacers in your vertebrae and drill holes and rods and screws, and so anyway, so I'm recovering from that.
And Vorlog, for those who are watching, is Vorlag.
GE.
GE, yes. So that's how you spell Vorlag, for those of you who want to look that up. So there's two different sets. The one that was used, the Bible that had been the Bible forever. In this Vorlag that was used, actually three different types. You go into that in the book. I won't make you explain that because we're running out of time again. Right. Three different versions that were used and combined to become what is known as the Masoretic text, which was used as the principal source for the King James Bible. I just want, this is when you stop and think about this for just a minute, think of the magnitude of what is being said when you consider what you've pointed out in your book, which is why people need to get this book. It hides purposefully the Messiah and why he came for salvation, and then he would come in the flesh, and the genealogies, not just in their minds simply to hide who he was.
Two particulars, the one in Genesis 5 and the one in Genesis 11.
So it hides the genealogies or messes with them. I mean, the implications were for his own purposes, of course, to hide the Messiah immediately, but the implications that it has on for all following generations, for us, these past 2,000 years, become just that much more magnified as we seek to go back and understand history.
Correct.
If you're using that as your principal source, as the source for that information, then you can understand the confusion that can abound, or trying to put square objects into round holes. It's just right. It's and you talk about some of these arguments in your book. When it comes to true, real science, not scientism, but real science, and it does end up making Christians foolish because you're using false information. compared
Yeah,
to
I mean,
what's.
one of the, there's two or three major points that I want people to understand. One
Thank
is
you.
that the scripture is infallible, it is inerrant. It is
Thank
given
you.
by God, all right? And it is there, and it pervades the King James Version. King James Version certainly is the Western world's most important book. Millions have been saved through it.
Amen.
All right.
Amen.
So we're not saying, boo on the King James Version. We're pointing out though that those that wish to say how God has preserved his text is because he caused 47 scholars in 1611 to create a pristine, inerrant English version of the Bible. That's how God preserved his text. That is foolish, because that Bible was revised many times, and it was also based upon, the New Testament was based upon the Textus Receptus of Erasmus from 1511, who had 6 manuscripts. Today in the New Testament, we have 6,000 manuscripts. All right, so we have, in other words, if we only go with the 1611 King James, authorized King James Version, which, by the way, was, as I said, revised. The one that we actually look at today is I believe it's the 1789 revision by a guy named Blaney. That's the version of the King James that we use today, or we look at today. But if we only look at that, we are making ourselves fools, because we have before us a wealth of riches, as the New Testament scholar Daniel Wallace says. In fact, he calls it an embarrassment of riches in terms of all the manuscripts that we have, through proper textual criticism, we can get back to what was the authentic message of God, to within a sort of 99.999% percentage that we can trust that what we have today is what was written by the original authors. Right? So,
and just to reiterate a point that we made last week again, because we've arrived at that point, is this brings us up to the Dead Sea Scrolls, that were the DS,
right,
which verified and confirmed for us that the scripture, the Septuagint that they had, was uncorrupted. It was virtually uncorrupted.
Virtually uncorrupted. It is the more authentic lineage of manuscript text. Its Vorlage is more trusted. And this is not just Christian evangelical scholars saying this. These are Jewish scholars saying this, such as Emmanuel Tav, who's one of the most noteworthy of all Jewish scholars. But let me get back to the point I was going to make. So, preservation of the text, as you'll see, and I'll kind of jump to a conclusion here that you need to know. The Septuagint, what it provides for us is it is a remarkably powerful means to get back to what the original Hebrew said, even though it's a Greek translation. Right? And so it is vital to the issue of textual criticism. Right? Now, the other key point, which is where a lot of the book focuses, is not just the conspiracy of the rabbis in the 2nd century, but it's their changing of the chronologies, the genochronologies or chronogenealogies of Genesis 5 and 11, because it's with those changes that we also look like fools when we try to establish the primeval dates or history of the Old Testament. To be specific, I'm not saying that, I'm not talking about the fact that there is or isn't an old earth. I'm saying that the King James Version dates the creation, let's just say of Adam and Eve right now, at 4004 BC. The Septuagint dates it at roughly 5600 BC. And one of the things that the book points out is if you look at all of the old testimonies, or the testimonies for the dating of what the scripture should be, that it is the older date, the 5600 BC. I arrive at 5616 BC is the date that I calculate. The church fathers like Irenaeus, Tertullian, and so forth, Clement, they arrive at the same date of around 5600 BC. Josephus arrives at 5600 BC. There is another book called The Histories of Biblical Antiquities, which was a Latin book I'll try to impress you with my Latin. It was called the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum. There you go. The LAB, L-A-B, which is what we'll call it. It is virtually identical to the Septuagint's dating. And it was written at the same time or slightly before the time that Jesus taught on the earth. It isn't until you get into the first century that you begin to see these alternative dates. And it's because of the rabbis' changes in the Torah in Genesis that we begin to see the shortening of these dates. We may not have time to talk about it tonight. We talked a bit about it before, but the reason they fussed with the dates was because they felt that the dates and the chronology had a lot to do with who could or couldn't be the Messiah. And they shortened the dates, trying to say that it was not yet time for the Messiah to come. But according to the Septuagint's dates, and according to their tradition at that time, it was time for the Messiah to come. He was to come between the 5,000th and the 6,000th year. And just to make that clear, we live today around if the Jewish calendar were properly built based upon the Septuagint and throwing away the Seder Olam Rabbah, which was written also by one of Akiba's disciples around 160 AD. If we got rid of that, the current Jewish calendar date would not be 5778. It would be approximately 7500 AD, or 7500 since the time of the creation of the world. Right now, the issue of New World, Young Earth creation, all that's a separate issue. My book is neutral on that,
but we'll talk about that sometime.
We can talk about that, but my book is attempts to be neutral on the issue of gap theory versus young Earth creation. The main point I'm making is that the proper biblical chronology is in fact 1,600 years more should be added into that dating than what the King James Version and Bishop Ushers dating.
Some people are going to have a cow on that.
Awful, utterly awful.
They're going to have a cow. So,
yes, indeed.
We've actually only got about 8 minutes left in the time I promised you that we have. So and I know we keep some of this stuff is rehashed, but I think what it tells us, Doug, is how important and how detailed and how much information is really packed into understanding the history of the scriptures, where they come from, what is going on during that time. Right. It's so important, I think, for all of us to get a good handle on exactly what has taken place there. Your documentation is superb in here, so I encourage people to check it out. But basically, I mean, and it doesn't surprise. We more modern history, or history I think more of us in the Western world are more apt to know about, is you see and it's a repeat of what we see happening in the Catholic Church. And I'll just read from your book here. This is on page, I think, 111 of the PDF here. But it says, so when did this oral law historically commence? Different sages offer various answers to that question. Some say during the time of the Hasmoneans. I'm not going to read that word. Hasmoneans. Thank you. Yeah. Others asserted it went all the way back to Abraham before the written Torah was even given to Moses. According to Gur R. Naaman ben Isaac, writing several centuries after Jesus Christ, maintained that only the Pharisees could or would transmit the oral law. Right. No one else could. It was not in the possession of all Israel. With the destruction of the Pharisees, the world would be desolate as it was before God gave it form. It would be without the oral Torah. I mean, you see these guys keep, again, they're the keepers of it. It's secret knowledge only. They have the ability to interpret it. I mean, who does this sound like to us?
Yeah, it's Jewish Gnosticism.
It's exactly what we see formed in what would become the Catholic Church, is it not?
Right? Well, that's
with
right.
The setting up of the
you have someone in the middle, a mediator, someone that has to be in the middle.
These things never change.
Yeah. Well, that's right. Ecclesiastes was right. Nothing new under the sun, right?
Yeah, but one thing that I want to point out too in here that maybe I don't know that it's mentioned in your book anywhere is that in order for these guys to maintain their lie, they have to keep for themselves what is the actual standard or the truth, which is why I don't think these things have been destroyed. I think they've been squared away, hidden in rabbit holes for they themselves to refer to, because they have to have a standard they themselves so that they don't get confused by their own lies, down the road in their teachings. It's like for math, we use here in the Western world, we use the Dewey Decimal 12 measurement by 12s, 12
Right.
24 or 3 feet for our yard, and we use that system. Whereas, they try to confuse that and use the decimal system, which is a measure of tens.
Yeah, the metric versus the English system.
Which came from Queen Elizabeth, and
which really came from the Romans before that.
Right.
Yeah.
So all of that,
right,
you can count using either version, but one version will hide the important numbers of the other.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? You can measure with each. Each is accurate, but they hide the numbers from the previous system. Essentially, when it comes to words, this is what is being done here. They have to have knowledge of the standards so that they can use the proper words to hide them within it.
Yeah.
If that made sense to anybody, bless you.
The simple way to say it is that they knew what they were doing. They were obscuring the truth.
Amen. But the important thing is that the standard is still there somewhere.
Right. Yeah.
I believe. That's just my opinion.
Let me clarify one thing, though, that's kind of related to this, which is an important point to make.
Sure.
One other thing that Akiba did is when they created this, we'll say the second Vorlog, from that Vorlog, additional new Greek translations would be created in an attempt to get the Jewish community to stop using the old Greek, the OG, the original Alexandrian Septuagint. All right, so that was part of their plan. This was Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodosius. They wrote 3 Greek translations of this new Vorlog at the end, towards the end of the 2nd century. The other thing that Akiba did, besides sponsoring those, Akiba also made sure that all other documents, all other manuscripts, all other possible ways to get back to the original was destroyed. So what he didn't count on was the fact that the Essenes hid what we know as the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran. So in effect, the Essenes were undoing, whether they knew it or not, they were undoing what Akiba was doing by hiding, in effect, the originals, you might say, or many of the originals, not all, but many segments and sections of different portions of different books, mostly of the traditional Hebrew books, some of the, what we'd call the, Apocrypha, and some of what we would call pseudepigrapha, like Enoch and things like that.
That you can sum that up. We always see the kingdom of this world doing that too. We commonly know it today in the Western world as book burning.
Right. It was like burning the books.
But you always see the kingdom of this world doing that with information.
Right.
They always burn it when they feel like there's too much information there, or if they need to abscond with some information. They'll take it and then burn what's left. I mean,
it's just today it's like alternate media and mainstream media, right? The mainstream media, all the mainstream media, they all say the same thing. They have the same talking points from Politico and other sources. And then you line them up, 100 stations, and they all say the exact same things.
It's essentially the same thing.
Yeah, it's like burning books.
It is the same thing. It's the dumbing down of people. Well,
right.
I mean, so that is essentially what you talked about in chapter 2.
Yeah,
we'll try to do a parts 3 and 4 with you, Doug. Before I go,
we'll take it a chapter at a time if you want, and we'll get through the whole book.
Well, we won't do the whole book, but I want wanted to provide people enough of it to understand what this book does, because for me it's a must have. Now you wanted to share with us something is coming out in a couple days.
Yeah. Well, you can buy the printed paperback book now at Amazon. Thank you. That's the cover. It looks like that. The Kindle version of that book will be available probably before the weekend, certainly by the weekend. And so if you are inclined towards a Kindle version, I should have a Kindle version available for you before the weekend. So I want you to be aware of that. So I really believe, again, I'm totally prejudiced because I wrote this, but I believe, and I think you would agree, this will be one of the most important books you read this year.
Well, I told you this before. I think we went live last week. For me, Doug, I think this is to date your magnus opus of the books you read. I feel like this is the most bears the most weight, has the most bearing as far as breadth. Right. I don't want to say best because it's hard to say best. It's subjective.
It could set off a revolution. It certainly could get me killed. So you guys.
But I think it has the most breadth, and I'm not unaccustomed to writing things that could get you killed. So I can do that. So, but
I don't tell my wife that. But
Well, we don't tell wives that because they worry enough as it is. But
that's right.
But it's very important. We're going to have Doug on again for part 3 and 4. So a couple things. Be in prayer for Doug for a speedy recovery from his back surgery, that he gets back to his normal working self and able to get around and do those things he needs to do. I want to lift up Chris and Liz Bailey in prayer, just very dear in my heart. Just keep those guys in your prayers. And the third thing is, I think tomorrow I am scheduled to be on with Dr. Lake and Dr. Michael Spaulding, who you were on with early tonight, tomorrow to do their Kingdom War Room update. I think we're going to be talking about my book then. So if you guys haven't subscribed to them, be tuning in tomorrow night. I'll be talking with them. We will see you maybe next week, Doug, if you're able to, and health and have the energy.
Be a little bit better next week.
Yeah, we'll pick it up. I thank everybody for joining us here tonight. On Disputed Lands, it's been a great time as usual, Doug. Get some rest until we see you guys the next time.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yep. Night, everybody.
Good night.